When I first met Daniel, my stepfather, he seemed like the kind of man everyone admired from a distance, but rarely approached too closely. His voice carried authority, his posture radiated confidence, and yet there was something in his gaze that hinted at restraint, as if he was always holding back more than he revealed. My mother adored him, and in her joy, I tried to be grateful. After years of watching her struggle, seeing her smile again should have been enough. But what I hadn't expected was how complicated his presence would make my own life. Our household had an air of practiced order. Dinner was served around the same table each evening, conversation flowing in familiar patterns. My mother recounting her day, Daniel offering measured responses, and me listening, trying not to betray the thoughts that often tangled inside my head. I was 18, technically grown, but still tethered to an uncertain sense of self. My mother's happiness felt like an anchor, and yet I could not ignore how Daniel's presence unsettled me. It wasn't his words that stirred me so much as his silences. When he entered a room, the atmosphere shifted. When he brushed past me in the hallway, the heat of his arm seemed to linger long after he was gone. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks, feeding on insecurities and desires I hadn't yet dared to name. But imagination had a way of becoming too vivid, too real, especially in the quiet spaces of the house. At times, Daniel's attention felt accidental, a glance too long, or a hand that rested on my shoulder a moment more than necessary. He never said anything inappropriate, and yet those gestures carried weight. They clung to me, haunting my thoughts at night when I replayed them against the darkness of my room. I would chastise myself, whispering that he was my mother's husband, that nothing good could come from the curiosity swelling inside me. Still, the tension grew. Late evenings offered the most revealing glimpses into this unspoken conflict. Sometimes I would wander into the kitchen for water, only to find Daniel already there, leaning against the counter, sipping tea as though he had been waiting. Our exchanges were brief, small talk about school, the weather, or some trivial matter, but beneath the words was a current I couldn't ignore. His eyes held mine a beat too long, steady, and unreadable before he turned away. I told myself that these moments were harmless fragments of family life stitched together by coincidence. Yet deep down I knew better. My heart beat differently around him, and no amount of denial could slow it. That awareness was both thrilling and terrifying. It was during one of those quiet nights, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, that the thought of escape took hold. Not escape from the house, but from the relentless swirl of confusion inside me. I needed a reprieve, a moment where steam and water might wash away the questions I was too afraid to ask. The shower had always been that place, a sanctuary where the noise of the world muted, and I could breathe without expectation. I padded down the hallway, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. My mother had gone to bed hours ago, and Daniel's study door was closed. I convinced myself he was already asleep. Turning the bathroom knob, I slipped inside, grateful for the solitude. The mirror fogged as soon as the water roared to life, filling the room with warmth. I stepped under the spray, letting it cascade over me, closing my eyes as if the torrent might drown out everything else, the unspoken, the forbidden, the aching curiosity I could no longer ignore. The water wrapped around me like a veil, offering temporary blindness, temporary peace. For a few moments, it worked. My body relaxed, my thoughts scattered. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind, an unease lingered as if the silence outside the bathroom door was not as empty as I believed. I didn't know then that the sanctuary I had sought was about to dissolve, that the one person I had tried hardest to avoid in my most vulnerable moments would soon become impossible to ignore. The water fell in steady sheets, drowning the edges of thought, until the faint creak of the bathroom door reached me through the hiss of steam. At first, I dismissed it. Old hinges groaned at the slightest pressure, and perhaps it was nothing more than the house settling into the night. But then the sound sharpened, the slow press of wood against frame, followed by the unmistakable pause of someone standing at the threshold. My chest tightened. For a heartbeat, I was certain it was my mother, and panic rushed in like cold air through an open window. I imagined her shocked expression, her quick retreat, the questions that would follow. But when I turned my head through the haze of steam, it wasn't her. Daniel stood just inside the doorway, frozen as if he too hadn't planned this moment. His features were blurred by condensation, yet the unmistakable lines of his face were visible, his posture rigid, caught between intrusion and hesitation. The steam softened his silhouette, but the intensity of his eyes cut through the mist like a flame refusing to die. Time fractured into fragments. My pulse thundered. I expected him to stammer an apology, to shut the door at once, to pretend this interruption had never happened. Instead, he lingered, silent, watching. His gaze was not cruel or mocking. It was steady, unreadable, as if he was measuring something within me that even I did not understand. Daniel. My voice cracked, swallowed by the sound of rushing water. It was less a question and more a plea, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for, an explanation, an exit, or something I could not name. He blinked, the faintest shift in his expression, and then his voice emerged, quiet, almost careful. I didn't mean to startle you. The words should have brought relief, but instead they deepened the tension coiled in the air. If he truly hadn't meant to, why had he not turned away? Why did his voice carry a gentleness that unsettled me more than anger would have? I pressed my back against the cool tile, my breath shallow. You shouldn't be here. Daniel's lips parted as though to respond, but silence reclaimed him. He stepped closer, not into the shower, but near enough that the humid air wrapped around him. The faint scent of his cologne, earthy, restrained, mingled with the steam, filling my lungs until I could hardly breathe. I know, he said, finally, his tone low, weighted, but I couldn't leave. A dozen emotions warred inside me. Fear, confusion, and something dangerously close to longing. My mind screamed of boundaries, of betrayal, of the mother sleeping just down the hall. Yet my body betrayed me, locked in place, unable to look away from a man who had become the axis of my conflicted world. His gaze dropped for a moment, not in shame, but in contemplation, before returning to meet mine. You've been carrying something, he said. I see it every day. The silence, the restlessness. I can't pretend not to notice. His words pierced deeper than I expected, stripping me bare in ways the water never could. I had spent months believing my struggles were invisible, that no one could see the weight pressing on my chest. But here he was, naming it without judgment, acknowledging the part of me I thought I had hidden. The confession caught in my throat, heavy and dangerous. I wanted to deny it, to insist he was mistaken, but honesty clawed its way to the surface. I don't know what to do with it. Daniel's expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. You don't have to decide tonight, he said. You just need to know you're not alone. The tenderness of his voice disarmed me. I had braced for anger, for rejection, for anything that would push me back into the safety of denial. Instead, he offered reassurance, an anchor where I expected a storm. The steam curled between us, thick and suffocating, and yet the room had never felt more exposed. His presence ignited something unspoken, an electricity that hummed against the walls. My heart hammered as if daring me to step forward, to breach the fragile space separating us. But I didn't move. Neither did he. We remained locked in the tension of the moment, two people suspended in the impossible, aware of the boundaries, yet trembling at their edge. I had expected punishment, a harsh reminder of what must never be. What I received instead was something far more dangerous, the undeniable realization that he saw me, that he understood, and that neither of us could return to the innocence we had just shattered. The next morning, the house felt unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves remembered what had passed in the steam of the night. I moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, setting out bowls and pouring coffee, but every action carried the weight of what lingered unspoken. My mother hummed softly as she buttered toast, oblivious to the storm circling just beyond her sight. Daniel sat opposite me, calm and composed, Yet when his eyes brushed mine, the air thickened with an intensity only we could feel. I avoided looking at him too long. My hands trembled when I lifted my mug, though I prayed no one noticed. To my mother, breakfast was ordinary, the start of another day. To me, it was unbearable. I felt like a thief, sitting at her table, harboring a secret so vast it threatened to collapse the fragile order she treasured. After she left for work, silence reclaimed the house. I gathered my dishes, rinsed them beneath the stream of the faucet, trying to ignore the way Daniel remained seated, his presence pressing against my back. I expected him to speak, to address what had happened, but the words did not come. Instead, the silence stretched, binding us together with invisible threads of complicity. When I finally turned, his gaze was waiting. "You're angry," he said, though his tone carried no accusation. "I don't know what I am." I admitted, the truth cracking my voice. "I can't stop thinking about it, and that terrifies me." Daniel rose slowly, his movements measured, as though he feared startling me. "I didn't plan for last night," he said, "but I can't pretend it didn't happen. And I won't insult you by acting as though I didn't feel it too." The confession struck harder than any reprimand. My breath caught, my chest tightening under the weight of it. To hear him acknowledge what I had barely allowed myself to imagine was both a relief and a curse. The part of me that longed for connection stirred with dangerous hope, while the part tethered to guilt pulled me back toward despair. "You're my mother's husband," I whispered, the words sharp, almost desperate. "This shouldn't even exist." "I know," he replied quietly, stepping closer. His face held no arrogance, only conflict. "And yet it does. Denying it won't erase it." The truth of his words hung between us, undeniable. I wanted to believe that ignoring the memory would make it fade, but every beat of my heart reminded me otherwise. His nearness only deepened the fracture inside me. Loyalty to my mother on one side, a forbidden longing on the other. For days afterward, the tension persisted. In public spaces of the house, we acted as though nothing had shifted. Daniel discussed errands with my mother, repaired a loose cabinet door, carried out the roles expected of him. But when our paths crossed without her present, silence swelled again, thick and charged. His eyes carried a question he never voiced, and mine carried an answer I could not admit. At night, in the solitude of my room, guilt gnawed at me. I saw my mother's smile, her unshakable trust, and I hated myself for betraying it with even a thought. But alongside the guilt was something more dangerous, desire. I replayed his voice in the bathroom, the gentleness that cut deeper than any reprimand could have. I imagined the weight of his gaze, the possibility of what it might mean if I stopped resisting. Each thought was a betrayal, yet each thought refused to leave. One evening, after my mother had fallen asleep, I crossed paths with him in the hallway. For a moment we stood in silence, the glow of a lamp painting shadows across his face. His expression was steady, though I could see the same conflict mirrored in his eyes. Neither of us spoke, but the quiet stretched into an understanding. We both knew the line we had walked, and neither of us had turned back. "Some things," he said softly, almost to himself, "change everything." Then he stepped aside, letting me pass, his restraint more powerful than any touch. I lay awake for hours afterward, hearing his words echo inside me. He was right. Something had changed, something irreversible. I had expected anger, rejection, or even silence to close this chapter, but instead I was left with a truth more haunting. He saw me, he understood me, and he did not regret it. The weight of infidelity pressed heavily on my chest, and yet, beneath the guilt, a dangerous spark of longing remained. I knew life could never return to what it had been, and the secret we now carried was both a bond and a curse. And though I told myself I should hate the memory of that night, I couldn't. It had carved me open, revealing a part of myself I could never again bury. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night in the bathroom refused to fade. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the silence of footsteps echoing down the hallway, in the weight of every glance exchanged when my mother wasn't watching. Daniel and I never spoke of it directly, yet the bond it created only deepened in its secrecy. The unspoken held more power than words could have dared. I found myself observing him in ways I hadn't before. At dinner, I noticed how his hand rested casually on the table, veins traced like lines on a map I longed to study. When he laughed, a rare, subdued laugh, I felt the vibration in my chest as though it belonged to me. It was dangerous, this constant awareness, but impossible to silence. Every detail of him etched itself into me with increasing sharpness. Daniel, for his part, maintained his composure with unnerving precision. Around my mother, he was the picture of devotion, attentive, reliable, the man she had always wanted. But beneath that mask there were cracks. I caught him watching me when he thought my eyes were elsewhere, his gaze steady, contemplative, sometimes almost sorrowful. And when our eyes did meet, his silence said everything his lips could not. One afternoon, I returned from school to find him repairing a broken drawer in the living room. My mother was still at work, and the house hummed with the quiet of late sunlight. I lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to pass unnoticed or acknowledge him. He looked up before I could decide. "Can you hand me that screwdriver?" he asked. The request was simple, ordinary. Yet when our fingers brushed as I placed the tool in his palm, the air thickened instantly. He didn't pull away, and neither did I. The moment stretched too long for coincidence, yet too brief for indulgence. When he finally took the tool, his voice carried a roughness I hadn't heard before. "Thank you." I left the room quickly, my heart pounding, ashamed of how much that fleeting contact rattled me. In the solitude of my bedroom, I pressed my palms to my face, torn between anger at myself and hunger for more. The duality consumed me, loyalty clashing with longing, morality battling with the raw need to be seen. That night I dreamed of him, not in lurid detail, but in fragments, the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his voice, the way his presence filled every space. When I awoke, guilt clawed at me sharper than ever. My mother's voice called me to breakfast, and I sat at the table, forcing myself to smile, while the weight of my secret pressed like lead against my ribs. Daniel, as always, played his role flawlessly. He asked about my classes, listened attentively, and passed me the butter as though nothing existed between us. Yet, when his fingers brushed mine beneath the table, intentionally or not, the spark was undeniable. I withdrew quickly, but the damage was already done. The silence afterward roared louder than any conversation. The days that followed only tightened the knot inside me. Every interaction with him was layered, every shared space charged with the risk of discovery. And yet, despite the fear, I found myself drawn to him more and more. He was no longer just my stepfather. He had become the mirror reflecting parts of myself I had been too afraid to face. One evening, after my mother had gone upstairs early with a headache, Daniel and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The television flickered faintly, but neither of us paid it attention. He sat at one end of the couch, I at the other, the space between us stretching like a canyon we both longed and feared to cross. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "We can't keep pretending this doesn't exist." My throat tightened. "Then what do we do?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes held mine, steady and conflicted, before he said, "We wait. We control ourselves. Because if we don't, everything breaks." The words were both a warning and a promise. They acknowledged what lived between us while binding it in silence. It was an agreement without ceremony, a pact written in the air, heavy with consequence. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something undeniable. Our story was no longer a fleeting accident. It had taken root, deep and dangerous, growing in the shadows of our restraint. The line between betrayal and desire had blurred beyond recognition, and though we swore ourselves to silence, I knew the silence itself would only draw us closer. And in that knowledge, terrifying and intoxicating, I understood this was only the beginning.